Hi, I'm Peter Coroneos. On behalf of the Cybersecurity Advisors Network, I'd like to welcome you all to this exciting session on space, satellites and cybersecurity. I thought we'd start with a little bit of a historical clip just to set the tone for tonight's discussion, and then we're going to lead into our panelists.
I don't think that I deserved an F. Do you?
You can go to jail for that.
Only if you're over 18. This computer company is coming out with these amazing new games in a couple of months. And I want to play those games. Wow.
What?
We got something.
He found the right code word to play the game.
We're in.
But it was the wrong computer.
Shall we play a game?
How can I ask you that?
How about global thermonuclear war?
Fine.
All right.
What the hell?
They're trajectory headings for multiple impact re-entry vehicles.
How's that mean?
I don't know, but it's great.
All stations, this is Crystal Palace.
I wonder if I should use my subs.
22 Typhoon-class submarines departing Petropavlovsk.
What in the hell's happening here?
Oh my God.
Shall we play?
I have 7, correction, 8. That's 8 Redbirds. Get on the sack. Tell them to flush the bombers.
Russians are still denying everything, sir.
Who are you working with?
Nobody.
Why don't I believe you?
Today we have Soviet missile warning.
Placed under arrest pending indictment for espionage.
Espionage?
Confidence is high. I repeat, confidence is high.
Cobra Dane, is this an exercise?
Negative, this is not an exercise.
Get me the president on the horn.
It's still playing the game. It's gonna start a war.
Close up the mouth.
Is this a game or is it real?
War games. Playing soon. At a theater near you.
That little clip was from 1983 from the Hollywood production known as War Games. So I'm going to introduce our speakers first of all, and then I'm going to get some initial feedback on that video clip and to what extent we feel that that is an accurate representation or even comes close to the kind of situation that we face now in 38 years after that was made in now in 2021. So starting from the left-hand side on my screen, I've got Edward Farrell. Edward is a member of the Cybersecurity Advisors Network based here in Australia and a technical expert with a long history in cybersecurity, IT security. And so Ed's going to give us his take on things from a technical / sort of attacker kind of standpoint, and maybe even some defensive insights there. And then we have Dr. Samuli Haataja from the Griffith University. And Samuli is an expert in cyber law, has written extensively in this area, and also has written a book recently, which was called the Cyber Attacks and International Law on the Use of Force, the Turn to Information Ethics. So we're very much looking forward to your inputs tonight, Samuli, on those aspects of the problem that we're looking at. And finally, last but by certainly no means least, Professor Stephen Freeland. Stephen is a very highly acclaimed international authority on many things, but international law and particularly space law. He has a very esteemed CV. It was all I could do to condense it down to 400 words without it losing any impact. But he now sits on a 5-year working group as part of the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, as vice chair of that working group on the exploration, exploitation and utilization of space resources. So we've got an amazing lineup, and Stephen will be sharing in particular his perspectives in terms of formation of international norms, what international law and indeed space law has to say about the prospect of cyber attacks, and you know, if there's any hope for us to try and regulate this at a legal / I guess treaty level. But Stephen, you'll be the one that will be elucidating that area. But let me start with Ed. Ed, you watched the clip along with the rest of us. What was your take on, I mean, firstly, the insight that those producers had back in 1983 to even come up with a concept like a teenager hacking what was in fact military infrastructure. And then to the more relevant point, how realistic is that now in 2021?
It's interesting you talked about it being insights. It was actually a real world activity which I'll share amongst the CyAN network a little bit later that had actually informed a lot of those events, albeit with a bit of creative license from Hollywood. And funnily enough, the very same movie also translated into Ronald Reagan back in the early 80s, trying to work out, hey, is this actually something that can be done against us? But I would even say we probably want to go back even further in time to 1907, when Marconi was trying to demo his wireless technology to a few interested folks in London at the time. And a magician by the name of Neville Maskelyne decided to have fun with Marconi's wireless set by injecting his own transmissions, shall we say. And this was still Marconi saying, hey, look, it's actually quite secure. And yet, the events of World War I, World War II, and even modern day have suggested otherwise. So if we come back and define the environment, and we try and conceive what we're actually looking at here, when we talk about cybersecurity and space, well, let's have a look at what's happening. So I did actually prepare this demo previously. So if we were to take this as Earth and this wire here as our as a radio communication from a ground station up to a satellite station, this is pretty much what we're talking about here. So, all right, there we go. Hang on, my satellite is coming out of space.
There it is. Yeah.
So if we have our satellite communicating to our ground station to and from, this is pretty much a wireless communication. And this is kind of what I've taken interest in from my background with the Australian Defence Force Academy of, okay, well, what can we do from a wireless standpoint instead of pointing our antennas around the ground? Can we start pointing them out in space? So we have that communication to and from. So this is a little pie in the sky unit, which is designed to go up a little bit higher into Earth's atmosphere. But you think about a small piece of technology such as this. Some of the things I have on board this little small computer is GPS, altimeter, and a couple comes back down to Earth. Now, if we broaden that and we think about, okay, what's in that environment in space? Well, we've got GPS, which is used for a lot of things around navigation and time. We've got the means to communicate UHF radio and entertainment. We've also got wideband communications bearers such as Optus C1 and also Elon Musk's Skynet as well, going up into space as well to enable communications. There's also the enabling of things like some forms of automatic ship-based communications and aircraft comms, such as AIS and ADS-B now occurring over satellite, weather satellites, and that list goes on. And of course, we have ground stations. So we've actually got a lot of moving components. And then within that, we've also got to start thinking about, all right, these are aircraft that are on board this. We've also not only got our payloads that are achieving a particular effect, we've also got an onboard aircraft as well in space. And so, as I said, suddenly we've got, we've now got this simple concept of radio communications that we've had fundamental flaws with for over 110 years that are still with us today. And so, what are some of the threats and risks that we can think about here? And so things to be having in the back of our minds are, we've got flight control systems, we've got communications, we've got systems of systems that are achieving effects for us. So GPS for navigation, GPS for time. If we have a failure in time on, say, an authentication server, does that impact our ability to authenticate or even trust authentication processes? And And then even just outside of that, we have other considerations to be thinking about as well. So we're talking about flight control systems. If there's a collision as a result of a failure of one of those systems, do we get a Kessler effect where we have a cascading set of collisions? And then do we trust what's happening up in space as well? So it's a lot to start layering on top for everyone to be thinking about, but I think it's probably just one of those complexity items that I'm sure my fellow panelists will go through as well of. We've got a lot of moving parts to this, a lot of complexity, and yet a lot of volatility. And yeah, I'm conscious I've probably taken up a fair bit of time there if we want to continue and hand it back over to the panelists. I'm happy to jump back on some technical stuff later.
Ed, just let me ask you one quick question, like just a short answer. I mean, are you saying, because what I think I'm hearing is that because of both the complexity and also the known vulnerabilities that have existed and have basically migrated into satellite communications through the RADCOM's sort of history, yeah, we are looking at systems that are inherently insecure unless things are done to secure them.
I wouldn't say inherently insecure. I would say the evolution of the environment is creating insecurity. We look at that from a technical standpoint. I did hope to have a technical demo for you, but this is a software-defined radio. I can pick one of these up for a couple of bucks, and now I've got the means to transmit and receive to satellites. So we've now gone from cases where we had in the 1970s where only NASA could gain access to space to the ISEE-3 reboot, which is a side project. I'd recommend everyone look at it from a non-security standpoint, but something to have in the back of your mind there is that suddenly the effects of NASA from the 1970s could be taken by a couple of very smart people and put into a simple laptop and a software-defined radio to start to get an old NASA satellite into geostationary orbit around Earth. That's how far we've come, and here are issues that we didn't conceive of back then. That as we now move into a very different geopolitical environment, are starting to create some of these complexities that have certainly brought about our discussion here this evening.
So with this is my last question to you, and we'll move on, but with the democratization, as it were, of the technology by which satellites can be accessed, what could you actually do with that device that you've just shown us there, Ed? What's that capable of doing?
So very simple activities, things as simple as jamming. So can we deny communications or deny availability? Can we transmit to satellites and coerce a behavior that's not in their best interest? But also and therefore undermine integrity. Can we also receive, which there's been some really good activities in that space of can you receive communications and decrypt? Right. So there was a really good piece of research that was presented at the Chaos Communications Congress about decoding Iridium communications. And once again, I'll bring up the Apple. I mean, that's very much a simple case of we've got, say, up here where we have our satellite. If we can still be anywhere in that spot beam of that satellite, can we still receive the downlink and therefore conduct a case of interception there? And if the spot beam's wide enough, yeah, definitely. So with just some simple technology that's rarely available, that's achievable. But I guess I'll also throw in another one before I hand over to my colleagues. Is you mentioned democratization, and I think this is something that we also overlook from the case of countries that will not be named that have very authoritative and controlling processes around who's allowed to access the internet. If you've now got a network of communications that can jump over a particular country's firewall, does that pose a threat? And therefore, what actions would that threat actor look to take against those sort of communication systems?
Wow, that's an important insight. I think I was meaning democratization more in the sense of popularization of the devices. But I mean, that's a very interesting insight that you've looked at how you could apply that to subvert the sovereign policies of a nation that might not want their information interfered with in that way.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, I would say democratization of hardware, but also knowledge as well. And, 20 or 30 years of radio communications and cybersecurity research associated with that, has seen us go from academic environments to researcher environments down to now, script kiddies being able to perform certain activities. Simple case in point, some of the POCSAG research I had done 10 years ago, kids were then, in the last couple of years, were taking those same processes and doing things that they probably shouldn't have been doing with them. So, interesting idea of democratization and easy access. Right.
Well, that seems to be part of the story of cybersecurity, doesn't it? So, look, let's move on to Samuli now. Samuli, can we see you back on camera, please?
Yeah, I'm here.
There he is. Okay. So, listen, you've heard what Ed said. You've seen the clip. You're coming at this from a different perspective around the sort of legal and regulatory standpoint. What things jump out at you as you hear what Ed's saying here about some of those issues?
Yeah, thanks, Peter, and thanks, Ed, for that, high-tech tech demo that you had. So I guess some of the things that Ed was discussing, as well as were perhaps highlighted in the War Games clip we saw earlier. I mean, that was science fiction from the 1980s, but it still highlights some of the concerns that continue to be real today. So first, we talk about state activities in the cyber context generally. As Ed was talking about, our digital interconnectedness really creates vulnerabilities, and this has enabled states and other state-sponsored actors to then engage in a range of malicious cyber activities, really. We're seeing really is everything from election interference to ransomware. We're seeing these state-sponsored cyber threats, states using cyber means to engage in malicious activities in pursuit of their interests. A classic example, for instance, Stuxnet. Yes, it's 12 years old, but still shows how there you had the US and Israel really trying to limit the proliferation of nuclear weapons technologies, cyber means, or the WannaCry ransomware, which is understood to have been used by North Korea in an effort to circumvent UN Council sanctions and sort of raise funds for the government. Or other more recent examples of, let's say, the US, Russia, who are reportedly obtaining unauthorized access to each other's critical infrastructure, defending forward, like the US calls it. So really the proliferation of these digital technologies has increased the vulnerabilities of states, and it's also made possible for states to engage in new forms of activities. The second one, I guess, is this idea of anonymity. So, the internet, the makeup of the internet really fosters anonymity. You might be familiar with the classic New Yorker cartoon, how it said something like, no one on the internet knows your dog. I think the War Games equivalent was more of a sort of Turing test situation where, he didn't realize that he was interacting with this evil AI. But the point of our purpose is that it can be really difficult to determine who's responsible for a particular cybersecurity incident, particularly where there's nation states involved. And this is something that's really important from a legal perspective, because even if you can pinpoint the physical location of the computers used in a cyber operation, for example, as well as the human beings behind those computers, it can be still difficult to then attribute that conduct back to the nation state. Increasingly, what we are seeing is states coming out publicly. Australia, for instance, has done so recently, attributing particular cyber incidents to other states. So WannaCry was one example where Australia was among those states that came out and publicly blamed North Korea. So I guess it's a positive trend. We've got states sort of calling out each other's behaviour and seeking to push, norms of responsible behaviour in this context. And this really leads to, my third point, which is what is acceptable and unacceptable behaviour in the cyber context, particularly under international law. Espionage, for instance, which was mentioned there in that trailer, generally this is something that's considered acceptable and therefore tolerated under international law. But let's say then other activities like causing physical effects, like an explosion through cyber means, for instance, at, let's say, a nuclear facility, these sort of things at that extreme are clearly unacceptable. So states internationally have at least agreed that certain types of cyber activities are off limits, and would be in violation of international law. But the problem really is that while states not only agree to that on a general level, there still continues to be debate about some of the specifics. So you might have heard this expression of the grey zones of uncertainty, where the law is uncertain, and therefore you have states engaging in a range of activities in that space. A good example from recent years, again, is the Russian interference in the 2016 US presidential election. So that was never really labelled as a violation of international law, at least by the United States. For instance, the Obama administration categorized as more of a violation of international norms of behaviour. And most international lawyers would also agree that it sort of fell short what would be a violation of what's called the non-intervention principle. And yeah, it nicely illustrates how states can engage in these sort of unfriendly and malicious activities in these grey zones of the law without necessarily violating the law. Yeah.
Great. Well, listen, that really sort of creates more fodder for discussion now that we've got some nice interaction between what you and Ed have said. I particularly picked up on your point on attribution. Clearly, you know, historically, it's the capacity to attribute that has formed a brake on errant behaviour. And you know, the establishment of norms is only as good as your ability to enforce those norms. And without attribution, that becomes problematic. Okay, now that's a very good segue into Stephen Freeland. Stephen, thank you so much again for making the time to speak with us tonight. I'm going to just ask you to launch straight in and, you know, from a high-level view, what you've heard so far, and then lead us into what you think are some of the most troubling issues. I know that in one of the points that you wanted to raise was this sort of hypothetical situation of what a day without space might look like, because you have a legal practice that advises space clients. Tell us a little bit, when you're through with the sort of high-level international sort of norm piece, lead us back into a discussion on what we would be facing with major outages of the kind of communications technology that we've been talking about.
Thanks, Peter. Hi, everybody. I hope everybody's well, and thank you, Peter and CyAN, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Ed and Samuli, for such fantastic insights. Given the nature of the theme of this talk, I mean, one of the messages that I think is important is cyber and space are both essential elements of critical infrastructure of virtually any country. And if we're looking at it from an Australian perspective, absolutely from an Australian perspective. So they're both critical elements. What is, and most people accept that, although in my work with government, I, for a long time, had difficulties getting the relevant minister, who was quite happy to talk about what Australia is doing to protect itself from a cyberspace perspective. I kept on pushing ministers to say, add the word space as in the same sentence. And there was this reluctance. I think that's changing now, that reluctance to understand that they're both critical elements, but they both live in the same ecosystem. And so if a lot of our cyber infrastructure is dependent upon space technology, and as Ed and the clip shows, it works both ways. And so a compromise, an interference of one of them will in fact affect both of them. But looking at space in itself, from a legal perspective, there are some unique facets about space that differentiate it from cyber. We actually have a treaty regime, an international law regime that sort of gives us some principles about how it works. We don't have the same specific sort of regime for cyber activities. We have general principles of international law that Samuli referred to, but nothing more specific. And I think that's a failing for cyber, but it's also a difficulty into trying to understand the concepts. But the way space is directed is that we have technologies that you and I use every day, 20 or 30 or 40 times a day without even thinking about it. Space is critical for all aspects of our society. Ed mentioned some of them about transport and communications and financial transactions, but the list goes on and on and on and on. Agricultural management, disaster management, mining, navigation purposes, satellite television and all sorts of communication. You know, I could really list 30 or 40 different ways, weather forecasting, that space is essential. At the same time, space is used for all of these civil purposes. It's also an important element in national security and military activities. So all of these incredible technologies that you and I use every day were developed initially with purely military eyes, and then and continue to be used for military purposes. But then, of course, the commercial aspects of it were spun out. So you and I, as consumers, buy more and more in this stuff. And in fact, space is this incredibly multi-billion dollar commercial industry that's growing at 3 or 4 or 5 times the global economy. So there's a whole range of vested interests in the commercial sector that want to make sure that it's not compromised. So it's complex, it's big, and yet, as Ed foreshadowed, some of the infrastructures upon which countries are incredibly dependent were developed not necessarily with the perspective of how to protect it from its vulnerabilities to access through cyber technology. And so there is this, in a sense, mismatch of protections. You know, we have developed cyber activities to defend our cyber capabilities, but we haven't really thought about it in terms of cyber capabilities impacting upon space and vice versa. In terms of interference with space activities, that's happening all the time because space is so crucial to every country. You have a whole range of activities. Ed mentioned jamming, and there's other activities like spoofing, and you know, you could speak to the techies and they would give you many ways in which countries on a regular daily basis are trying to interfere in a non-kinetic way with the space activities of others. And Samuli mentioned vulnerability, and I think I'll end there, but then open the discussion. Vulnerability is absolutely threshold in this regard. A day without space, as you said, would be a disaster for virtually every economy in the world. It would be a disaster for the military and national security side. But in Australia, for example, our infrastructure would completely collapse. Our sewage systems would collapse. Our traffic systems would collapse. Our financial systems would collapse. So many elements of the way that we are used to the functioning of society would collapse. And so there's this interesting dichotomy with space. It's competitive. It's used for national security benefits. But on the other hand, the major spacefaring countries, given that all countries are dependent, but obviously there are some that are so dependent because they have such capabilities, the major spacefaring nations all have something in common. That is, if we develop technologies that in a sense make space unsustainable, or they become theatres of warfare where we're trying to compromise our opponent in an irresponsible way, that will also bite us in the backside. And so, unlike other great challenges of life, say climate change, I mean, climate change will affect everybody, but those most affected will be the poorer countries, at least initially, the island states. With space, if we have a day without space, if we compromise our ability to access space, we will all be impacted in many ways, but those most affected will be the major spacefaring countries, the United States, so the Russians, Chinese, the Brits, the Canadians, etc. And so even though they compete with each other, even though they try to push the envelope, they also realize that if we go a step too far, if we cross certain lines, then in fact, we're doing ourselves a disservice as much as someone else. So there is this eternal hope that at least countries will be responsible. But you mentioned about democratization and access to technology. Of course, that's the same in space. And now you have non-state actors who also have capabilities in space. Are they guided by the same constraints? Will they be as disciplined in terms of ignoring the consequences of their actions? We don't know, but there are certainly vulnerabilities. But the important message for the audience here is that those vulnerabilities are as much tied up with cyber activities and our dependence on cyber, and it works both ways. Back to you, Peter. Thank you.
That's a beautiful analysis, and I think I can imagine, people thinking through what you've just said. But before we pass back to the panel, I just wanted to ask you one question, Stephen. Given your, background in international law, could you explain to us to what extent international law applies to space, and what are the norms and the treaties that govern space at the moment, and how might they impact on malicious actors that may be state-based? I mean, it's much harder if you're talking about like that teenager we saw in the video clip or a criminal gang. But if it's a state-based, and if it could be identified and attributed to a state actor, what does international law say about that, and what sanctions lie against such actors?
It's a great question. So space is an area that is governed by international law, so not national law. So Australian law applies to the airspace above us. Australian law does not apply to the outer space above us, although it might apply to objects or personnel, but that's a different issue. So it's akin to the high seas. Australian law doesn't apply to the high seas, but it might apply to ships on the high seas and the people on there. So we have a series of treaties. They were developed in the 60s and 70s. A lot of people say, well, they're all old and outdated, but they're not. They've given us a set of fundamental principles that, notwithstanding the incredible rapid development of technology and all of the challenges that there are and the increasing strategic value of space has actually worked well. We haven't had wars. We've been able to garner incredible benefits for the whole of the global humanity. You and I use space in ways that we couldn't imagine living without. So we have a treaty regime. The fundamental principles are around notions of peaceful purposes, yet the dichotomy is that the technologies were developed in a Cold War situation with military eyes. So, at one and the same time, we talk about cooperation and peaceful purposes and taking due regard of the rights of others. But of course, there are military uses, not weaponized uses, although that's a danger, but military uses for terrestrial purposes. All wars now are fought using satellite technology. There are other principles where countries take responsibility. So you talked about attribution. Countries take responsibility for the operations of satellites, even if those satellites are operated by private actors. So a private actor, it's a very broad attribution. A private actor has a satellite that's launched. Let's say it's Peter, you have a satellite launched into space. You do something wrong, or it crashes into somebody or whatever. Assuming you're an Australian national, Australia would be on the hook, both from a responsibility viewpoint and perhaps also from a liability compensation viewpoint. So these laws were put together in a different era, but they work quite well. That said, technology has raced ahead. Clearly, we need to adhere to those principles, but augment them with more specifics about some of the things we can do now that were not even in the contemplation of those when the treaties were put together. I hope that's helpful. Thanks, Peter.
Very helpful indeed. Thank you, Stephen. I think at this point, we'll move back to Samuli just to respond to what Stephen's just told us. And then I'd like to circle back to Ed to just pick up another couple of insights, maybe at the technical level, maybe some scenarios that Ed might play out for us, and then we could probably then open it up for some questions. So Samuli, your recent book on the turn to information ethics, cyber attacks and international law and the use of force, what parallels do you see, listening to Stephen and Ed, that might come into play through the international legal system and the way in which cyber behaviour is being governed? And what relevance do you think any of those things have for what we're talking about here tonight?
Thanks, Peter. So, I mean, one of the key parallels perhaps is this question of to what extent does or is there international law that applies activities in this conduct? So, I mean, traditionally there's been this perception that the cyber context is some kind of lawless Wild West where there is no sort of international law that applies. That's not really the case. States have agreed. I mean, just this year, there's been 2 UN processes in which states have sort of reached consensus on this issue that, yes, international law does apply to their cyber activities, as they call them. But like I mentioned earlier, though, there's still debate about the specifics. So there's a number of principles that might be subject to interpretation or contested about, exactly how they apply. Something that I looked at in my book that you mentioned, is this idea of a use of force. The use of force language comes to international law from the sort of World War II context. So from that sort of technological context, violence was understood in certain ways. States using armed force, tanks, artillery, kinetic weapons, and death and destruction, and so forth. But how does that then translate to the current technological context in which a cyber operation might cause disruption opposed to destruction, even though the effects ultimately might be as serious? So one of the issues that I looked at in my book and what is still less subject to debate now, but when is a cyber operation or a cyber attack a use of force? Yes, clearly when, let's say, it causes physical destruction, that could harm or injury to human beings, that's clearly equatable to a traditional use of armed force. And many states have come out to support a position saying, yes, in those sort of circumstances, it would violate the law. But there's still continuing to debate about what about below that threshold. So what about if it's only economic effects, or let's say critical infrastructure is temporarily disrupted, but there's no actual destruction? Would that qualify as a use of force? And there is no sort of one answer to that necessarily. Different states would approach that in different ways. And that's, I guess, one of the ongoing challenges. So, this lack of consensus around the specific application of these really important rules of international law.
I think it's particularly interesting around this threshold issue of what constitutes use of force, when combined with attribution, really sort of brings us back to the starting point, which is, what if a non-state actor using some commonly available device was to institute a non-kinetic attack against a piece of space infrastructure, let's say a satellite. It seems like there's still a little bit of a grey area there. If it's not force, and it's hard to sheet home attribution, then I think we're left in sort of a grey zone area where there can be contestable behaviour out there that's hard to regulate. And I think maybe we'll get another word from Stephen on that. But Ed, I know you have to leave in a minute. Can you just give us some pointers on what you think defences might look like? Let's look at we've been talking about attacking, but what might a defensive strategy look like if you were the owner of some space infrastructure wanting to shield it from attack?
Yeah, interesting question, Peter. I think it's almost, we have to return back to what I said before of, human beings been on this planet, we've been writing, we've been forming governments, we've been waging war for the last 5,000 years, and I hope that nothing is new under the sun. And so if we come back to, you heard me mention before about 1907 and this idea of us being a little bit uncertain around radio and its impact and influence, which we then saw translate into World War I and World War II, of which we saw the value of encryption when done right as a means of protecting confidentiality and integrity of our communications and building out that trust. And we now do see that in certain GPS systems that require encryption in order to interact with them. And so, if we're looking at technical measures, that's certainly a start. And then we have increase in power, but also redundancy and resiliency in these systems and in terms of our total system as well. Of what does that look like? So, can we sustain communications through alternate means, whether that's HF or fixed line communications? Can we have our onboard flight control systems, if we have access denied, can they react appropriately in space? Or, will we see a completely different mechanism of how we engage with them physically change? So, will this turn into control of space-based effects from space because ground stations are no longer able to communicate? Or do we have the smarts on board to think for us? And so I think there's going to be a lot of complexity in that space over the next 30 to 40 years around technical defences. In terms of detecting when a threat is realised, I think that's going to be another important an important role as well. And if that becomes either a military effect or even a civil effect, what role does that have to play? But I think also some of the discussion on war, I think, will be really, really awesome as that technical stuff on the ground starts to build up, because, I think another thing we are seeing, especially in warfare, is we are seeing, we've already seen it in cyberspace and we'll see it in space, a challenge to the Westphalian concept of war and only nation states engaging in war. We've already seen that in Eastern Europe and even to a certain extent here in our own backyard. So I think there's technical defences, but they only go so far. I think there's going to be accepted norms with how we interact, and I think the techie in me that is looking at an elephant under a microscope almost needs to defer to my colleagues who can tell me it's an elephant. What does that look like? So I think it's going to be interesting in the space for the next few years.
Great. Well, I feel like we picked a good topical issue to talk about, but I think maybe it's a good time now to invite some of our participants to post some questions into the chat. We've had one from Ben Jones already asking the panel around the issue of the private entry into space through the some of the billionaires that are now establishing themselves as would be space protagonists. Stephen, I think it was you that said that if they're citizens of a jurisdiction that is subject to a treaty, then they would be bound by the laws of that jurisdiction. Was that a correct interpretation of what you said? Or
well, in fact, every person is bound by the laws of the country, of the jurisdiction that they're under. But most of the spacefaring nations, and certainly the United States, if we're talking about Bezos and Musk, is a party to the main treaties. Under those treaties, the United States, but like Australia, has obligations to ensure. So the treaties obviously just bind the countries, but as part of that, the United States has an obligation to ensure that the activities of private entities don't diverge from the fundamental principles of the treaties. And so how do countries do that? They pass national law. So Australia, for example, has national space law. We authorize, we supervise activities of private actors who want to go to space, bearing in mind that even after we've authorized and supervised them, as I said before, we also have responsibilities and international law and liabilities if things go wrong. It's the same in the United States. They're actually pretty good at this. Obviously, the United States, like Australia, our space agency has said we want to encourage industry. So obviously the United States is the same, because they see industry as having the smarts to develop the technologies which will allow the United States, in their case, to develop and leap ahead further, both militarily, but then also with spin-offs on the commerce. So countries encourage entrepreneurship, they encourage private industry, but they have responsibilities. And so, I think we can get a bit carried away with billionaires in space. That is only one tiny, tiny part, but high profile and good media coverage, and everybody likes reading about it, but it's only one really tiny part of what is going on in space. and the sorts of activities. So we shouldn't, I don't think, get too carried away, but it is a responsibility of the United States to manage, SpaceX, to manage Blue Origin, whatever. And, if they don't, then, they are responsible for that. Likewise in Australia. But they're just one small part of a much broader picture. If I can just touch on the defence issue, because it is relevant for space, very relevant. So I mentioned that an underlying principle for space with peaceful purposes. We can have a debate all day about what that means, but many people thought that meant you could not engage in any military activities in space. But yet, as I said, right from the beginning you could. And so right from the beginning countries did. And so they developed this understanding that peaceful purposes meant you could engage in military as long as they weren't aggressive military activities. So, using the basketball vernacular, you have to go for defense, right? But what is a defensive space capability? Because you can't, when a rocket is on the ground, you don't know whether it's a missile or a civil rocket. You can only tell once it's taken off. And once it's in space, you don't know exactly what it might be used for. So it's very difficult to say things are purely defensive assets in space as opposed to quote unquote weapons or aggressive. And that's the difficulty. And we're hearing more and more now about various countries saying we need to defend our assets in space. We need to create maybe exclusion zones. That goes against the very, very underlying premise of space, which is that you can't appropriate it. You can't exclude. There's free access for everybody as long as they do it according to the rules. And so we're beginning to see clashes now through this idea that we've got to defend our assets in space and we should do it in any way, shape or form that we can. Back to you, Peter.
Great. Again, a very comprehensive answer, and thank you, Stephen. I saw that Ed wanted to have some input onto that question as well. Ed, what was your contribution to that?
Yeah, I think Stephen went into a lot of depth on that one, and brilliant. I think the only addition I would probably factor in is what we've already seen in cyberspace with folks that are coming into an environment and doing so in what could be described as a lawless manner. There was a really good analysis done on what that looked like when we started to see a lot more aggressive threat actors in cyberspace some 15 years ago, which was that in such lawless environments, one has to be lawful. And so the interdependencies on a lot of these actors economically on what's still back on the ground here is such that there is an ecology to this that both economically minded individuals such as Musk, Branson and Bezos, still have to have that in the back of their minds to act responsibly, but also the mutually assured destruction that I believe Stephen briefly alluded to. That in itself, whilst not necessarily codified in law, is such that people will have to behave in a certain way, and one would hope that those would be recognised in their behavioural norms. But yeah, that was really what I just wanted to add to that. You will forgive me, I do have to depart. I am also teaching on the SSCP course with ISC Squared this evening. So Peter, thanks for having me, and I'll let you end.
Thanks, Ed. Just before you go, there are questions in the chat. What I might do is email the panelists those.
Yeah.
So if we don't get a chance to answer them on the call, the people that shouldn't feel disappointed, we'll try and get back to you with some answers.
Please
Thanks,
do.
Ed. Yep.
Yeah. And thank you for that. And I am keen to continue the discussion. So please send them through, email them through, and let's keep evolving this. Thanks again for organising this.
Great work. Thank you, Ed. See ya. Bye. So we've got 5 minutes left, and I've got a couple of questions here in the chat that either Samuli or Stephen might like to respond to. This one might be good for Samuli. It comes from Patrick Fair, member of CyAN, a close friend of mine, and he says, how do nation states ensure interception and content regulation when services are delivered from space objects responsible to other nation states? How is this playing out?
there isn't a lot of regulation about the content of space. As I said, space should be used in particular ways. It's dependent upon frequencies. There are all sorts of authorization and continuing supervision. But the treaties and the regulatory framework don't have a lot to say about the uses in terms of the content of space. That is as much an issue of national law. But, Ed was talking before, and you were talking before, Peter, about countries feeling that technology infringes on their sovereignty. And this happened not so much now, but certainly in the relatively early days of space technology, when only a relatively small number of countries had access to the technology, and they were able to, for example, beam in television programming into countries, let's say, like Iran, or China, where there were millions of people that had illegal satellite dishes, were able to pick up information that may be contrary to, let's say, the moral values or the laws of those particular countries. And so less developed spacefaring nations at the time were complaining that this was another form of colonization, neo-colonization, by using space assets for propaganda purposes and to send in messages, through this technology. It's changed a bit now because more and more countries have capabilities, but it's still fair to say that space is used for a whole range of purposes. And human rights people say we all have a right to information, but is there any surprise for us that Twitter and Facebook and Google and Amazon and Apple are all now heavily engaged in space technology as to add to their own terrestrial capabilities? And we're all having questions about at least some of the contents of some of those platforms. So if they access space and utilize that, that will give them greater possibilities to allow for information to be disseminated, and that might be information that perhaps isn't necessarily entirely accurate. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. Well, look, we're at the end of our time, but as I say, I've captured the questions from the chat, and what I'm going to invite the panelists to do, if they're willing, is to respond to those offline, and we'll post that when we post a record of this conversation, this video. We'll put the answers to those, or the question and the answer with it as well, and that way we'll be able to get to the questions that we couldn't get to in time. So just before I leave, I'm just going to, well, firstly, to thank our three panelists, Professor Stephen Freeland, Samuli Haataja, and Ed Farrell. Thank you so much for your participation, expertise tonight. It's been a great discussion. I feel like we could have gone on for another couple of hours at least, because this is really such a vibrant and evolving topic. And for those of us that come from a cybersecurity standpoint, can see the parallels. And I think that's the reason we had so much interest in this talk, is we're already seeing parallels and what has happened in cyber. Could it happen in space? And I think, Stephen, to your credit, you're across both areas. And I think the degree to which the three of you interacted in tonight's discussion has really helped our understanding of what the interplay between those factors are. So thank you very much for your time tonight. For those on the call, this is just a little quick plug to CyAN. We're a global not-for-profit network. We call it a trust network of cybersecurity professionals worldwide. I'm just going to post into the chat now some information about CyAN. You can go and check us out before you leave tonight. And we very much look forward to seeing you again. We've got your email addresses. If you're consenting to our further communications with you, then we'd love to invite you back to another discussion of a similar kind. So it's Peter Coroneos here for the Cybersecurity Advisors Network. Thank you all for your participation tonight, your questions and your contributions, and we'll see you again soon.